Lopez wants it away.
And it's hit deep to left center. Andrew Jones on the run. This one has a chance. Home run! Mike Piazza and the Mets lead 3-2. Bartolo has done it! The impossible has happened! This is one of the great moments in the history of baseball.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mets fans of all ages, here is your host, Nick Durst. Hello, Mets fans, and welcome back to another edition of Bleav in the Mets right here on the Bleav Podcasting Network, or of course on YouTube where you are watching us. Nick Durst here, and right now the Mets, they're not looking that great on paper for the roster-wise going into the next season of 2024, but this should be no surprise if you believe what Max Scherzer said when he said Billy Epler and Steve Cohen told him the Mets are not necessarily going to try to win in 2024. They're maybe retooling a bit going ahead to 2025, and that seems to be what's happening right now. And for the Mets here, their pitching rotation, it's pretty much set. A lot of what ifs, and keep the fingers crossed with Luis Severino coming off a career worst year, Adrian Hauser off a career worst year, Quintana off a year where he missed half the year. Got to hold your breath a bit, and now the trend continues as Sean Manaea is a Met, and he's coming off a year where he spent most of the season in the bullpen. So joining me now to discuss this and break it all down, you may have seen his work in The Athletic, because that's where he works and writes about baseball and the Mets. And here he is, Tim Britton. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right into it. Sean Manaea, he's a Met now. Why? Why is he a Met? Why was he someone they targeted and thought it was the perfect fit for this roster?
You know, I think we talked about going into the offseason how Yoshinobu Yamamoto kind of stood apart from the rest of the free agent class for the New York Mets, and that, you know, they would go all out after Yamamoto, which they did, and they fell short with him choosing LA. But beyond that, the pitchers they were going to look at were bounce back candidates and guys in kind of the Jose Quintana mold from last year. Guys you can expect to get deals like Quintana's, which was 2 years and $26 million. And here's Sean Manaea, who happens to be left-handed like Quintana, signing for 2 years and $28 million. You know, Manaea, what they like is the upside there. This is a guy who not that long ago was one of the better starters in Major League Baseball, first-round pick pedigree. Look, no one likes hearing these things when a guy is 33 still, but changed his repertoire a little bit in the latter half of last year, really at the end of May, and pitched very well from that point forward. So, you know, is a reasonable risk-reward proposition for them at this point. But when you combine it with everything else they've done, probably leaves the fan base a little underwhelmed.
I would say best case scenario for Sean Manaea is perhaps they trade him at the deadline for a young reliever, because I just don't know if this team is necessarily going to be all that competitive. I think if you look at the rosters from last year to this year, I mean, it's still an unfinished product right now, and we'll talk about that. But it seems that the roster maybe took a step back, I would say, at this point. And they haven't done anything at this point, Tim, to address the bullpen. What are you hearing about the bullpen? Because last year, obviously, Diaz was out, but I thought even with Diaz, if they had him, the bullpen left a lot to be desired. Now they lose Ottavino. Obviously, Robertson's not there. So are you hearing anything as far as maybe the Mets are going to turn their attention now to the bullpen, or do they want to continue with their trend of having those optionable arms?
Well, I think the bullpen is someplace we still might see additions, and maybe their highest profile addition to the bullpen is still out there. That would not surprise me by any stretch. But I do think they like the guys they've added and the diversity that they've added to their bullpen crew. You know, one of the major issues they had last year was that everyone who coming out of that pen threw 94 and a slider, you know, and especially once David Robertson was gone. And so they wanted to get a little bit different. They wanted to add some velocity, which they got in Jorge Lopez and Austin Adams. Wanted to add different looks in terms of secondary pitches, which they got in, you know, a guy like Cole Sulzer. Look, are these the 8 guys you're going to go forward with? No, it's going to be a mix and match situation. But you look at David Stern's track record in Milwaukee with bullpens, a lot of no names in that bullpen leading up to Josh Hader at the back end, Devin Williams in the back end. And they were routinely pretty effective. So that's one area where I do think you have to give him more of a benefit of the doubt than maybe fans are likely to. But He's built good bullpens in the past without having to spend a ton of money. And I do think there is still room for maybe one more addition there before the end of the offseason.
Yeah, I would hope so. As the Mets fans were looking at this, and the bullpen is definitely a concern, but the rotation's a concern, the lineup's a concern. Last year, middle of the pack towards the bottom in a lot of offensive categories, especially with power. They were in the middle, but that was really two players hitting home runs in Alonso and Lindor. Obviously, the big thing for the Mets, as the fans are screaming for now for a number of years, is how about a DH? It seems that the DH team is going to be Mark Vientos and DJ Stewart. Obviously, Stearns, he's all about defense. I don't think we're going to see much of DJ Stewart in the outfield or Mark Vientos at third base, especially with Harrison Bader coming in and also Taylor in the trade with the Hauser trade. So there is some good quality players right now on the free agent market that the Mets could potentially target as DH. Jorge Soler, he could maybe play some outfield in an emergency. Bryce Hoskins, you need a backup first baseman anyway, unless you're going to go with Vientos there. JD Martinez, he's coming off an all-star year. Justin Turner, he could play some first and third base, or none of these guys, and they just go with Vientos and DJ Stewart. Any of these guys seem plausible to you that the Mets actually might go after them, and do they going to have to overpay to get these guys? Because I would think, especially with a JD Martinez or Justin Turner scenario, with their age, if all things are equal with the money, they're probably going to want to go somewhere that looks like they're going to be a winner this year. So what do you make of the whole DH situation right now with the Mets?
It's certainly plausible that they will add there. I think that, in terms of the rest of their position player group, maybe it's a guy who can play a little bit of third base and be a DH. So that's where Turner would fit in that scenario. I think they feel pretty set in their outfield now after the addition of Harrison Bader. But it's being opportunistic. It's all of those things that fans don't want to hear. Is we haven't seen the DH market move all that much. So obviously, Ohtani signed, Mitch Garver signed in Seattle. But beyond that, there's a couple trade options out there. Tampa Bay is looking to move a couple guys potentially. So there are options for them there. I don't know that it's going to be a 2-year, $35 million deal for Jorge Soler. I'd probably rule that out. But it wouldn't. Again, I wouldn't bet my house on the Mets adding a veteran DH, but I would not rule that out at this point. It wouldn't surprise me.
Are you surprised that the Mets, outside of the Hauser deal, because obviously Stearns had his ties there with the Brewers and knew him well, that the Mets have not been very active in the trade market this offseason? Because I know they want to hold on to the prospects, but they did acquire 4 shortstops at the deadline last year. They have Lindor, they have Mauricio, they needed pitching. So it just seemed like it kind of would match up, but they're going to this offseason. We'll trade some of these younger, maybe not high-end, starters in the majors, and that could be starting at shortstop, and we'll flip it and maybe get a reliever or something along those lines. Are you surprised that the Mets, they're really just kind of, holding their prospects tight to the vest this offseason?
Not really, just because, I think Stearns talked about in his introductory press conference that he'd be open to trades. But, I always go back to what Sandy Alderson would say when he was the general manager of the Mets. You've got 2 currencies, money and prospects, basically, to acquire major league talent. And for so many years, the Mets didn't use their money, they used their prospects. And that's why the system kind of fell apart the way it did in the latter half of last decade. And now they're trying to rebuild it back. And so there's not so much available on the trade market that makes you want to move players for them that you can't get in free agency. You look at the deal with Milwaukee for Hauser and Tyrone Taylor, that you're not giving up a lot in that instance in Coleman Crow, and you're basically taking on money. As much as anything, that is a deal where you're using your financial wherewithal to take on major league players. So I think that's been their MO for a little bit now, for kind of the last 2+ years, and I would imagine that would go going forward. There might be kind of that consolidation prospect trade down the line. I've seen people in our comments compare it to what the Knicks did to get OG Anunoby, like that kind of deal. But you mentioned all the shortstops in the system. Shortstop is not a bad position to have a lot of guys. Most guys who can play shortstop can play anywhere. If you have 4 catchers at the top of your system, then you've got an issue, and maybe that becomes a problem further down the line with Kevin Parada and Francisco Alvarez. But I think at this point, the Mets are just trying to compile as much major league talent as possible and see how it filters through over the next year or so.
So do you think the Mets will be able to trade Omar Narvaez? You talk about the catchers there. Obviously, he's probably not very happy being on the bench here with the Mets. And I think the Mets fans would be really unhappy if Tomas Nido is back on this roster opening day as the backup catcher. So what are you hearing about the Mets? Or is there actually any interest in Narvaez to move him?
I mean, I think it would be kind of similar to James McCann last year, where the Mets would have to eat a certain amount of the money, and at that point, you wonder, how worth it is it? It is an area where they have some depth because they have Nito off of the 40-man roster. They claimed Tyler Heineman earlier in this offseason. The catchers move through, like every catcher gets in that DFA purgatory where they get claimed and they get dropped from the roster over and over. So there's room to maneuver there. Stearns did that a lot in Milwaukee. It seemed every offseason he was bringing in some catchers and dealing some other catchers. But I think Narvaez, the price has got to line up. You're not going to get much. You're not going to get anything really of major league value in return. You're basically just unloading the salary. And that's something that the Mets don't really have to do. And maybe you hope that Narvaez captures some version of his best form, even in limited playing time.
So obviously this year it's all about, let's not clog up any spaces for prospects and whatnot. Who do you see being the first prospect to make it to the majors, and in what month could you particularly see that maybe happening?
It's probably someone like Mike Vassell. It's probably, he's the furthest along of that next starting pitching group. Although, everyone is kind of in a group there. You've got Vassell, Dominic Hamill, who spent all of last year in Double-A. Then you've got the guys who moved from High A to Double-A over the course of the season in Christian Scott, Bleav Tidwell, and Tyler Stewart. Those guys that might be a little bit more difficult to project them making the major leagues before the end of the season, maybe a September call up or something like that. But if they run into an issue where they need a starting pitcher, they need a long man or something to eat up innings, Vassell could be that guy. Luis Angel Acuna should start the year in AAA. Drew Gilbert should start the year in AAA. Even in Double-A, like my colleague Will Salmon has mentioned, when Stearns was in Milwaukee, Double-A is major league depth. Those are guys that you can see in the major leagues at any point in the season. So I would expect those guys to be up probably at some point in the year, but it's just a matter of opportunity. Who in front of them gets hurt, who in front of them doesn't perform, and where's that opportunity open? It's a little easier to project that in a starting rotation because everyone gets hurt in a starting rotation at some point.
I would imagine Gilbert's got a good shot to make the roster at some point this year, just because of the injury history of Marte and Bader. So that's two outfielders who get hurt. Nimmo was not hurt the last 2 years, but previously he would get hurt. So I think outfield is a spot there where he could potentially make the roster. And then you see Clifford getting to AAA, who, from what we read and hear, he's got the most power potential out of the Mets prospects now. Acuna, where do you think he's going to be playing position-wise to start the season in AAA? I doubt he's going to play shortstop. Is he going to be at second base? Or are they going to look at him in the outfield? Where do you think the majority of his playing time is going to come at AAA in April?
It does seem to make sense that he'd see more and more time at second base moving forward, because you've got in Jeff McNeil, you've got Lindor locked in at shortstop. We just went through this with Ronnie Mauricio last year, and you're not going to play him in the major leagues at shortstop long term, Acuna, that is, and so second base would seem to be the pathway for him. And because of McNeil's versatility in the outfield, and even if they wanted to try him out at third base again like they did several years ago, that would be a possibility for him. So I would imagine that it might not be where Luis Angel Acuna is the opening day second baseman for the Syracuse Mets and plays second base each and every day. But I would imagine that a larger share of his playing time will be there than it has been in the past. And I think because they've got Gilbert, because of what they've added in their outfield, it's maybe a little bit less likely that we see him in center field the way we might have otherwise.
Yeah, that would make sense. Now, the Mets in June, they're going to London. So I need to know, is Tim Britton going to be in Great Britain? Is there a column there that you could potentially work on? And at that point in the season, where do you see the Mets as far as being competitive wise? Are they going to be in the mix there, or are they going to be where we are anticipating them to be, right there, fourth place, battling with the Nationals?
Well, we haven't made our travel schedule yet. I'm not sure if I'm going to be there yet. I did actually go to London last month with my family. I tried to play it off as a work expense because I was just preparing for next year. They didn't go along with that. But that comes at a really interesting time in the season. I think a lot of people in baseball will tell you that Memorial Day is kind of your first checkpoint in a major league season, where you say, okay, what's happened so far? what's real, what's not, and what do we have to fix, and how do we have to kind of pivot between now and the trade deadline to be buyers at the trade deadline. That trip is, I think, like June 9th and 10th or something like that. So maybe a week and a half after Memorial Day. But is that time where you make that first evaluation? We've seen, it's funny they play the Phillies. The Phillies at that point in the season, the last 2 years, have not been in a good spot either of those years. If you look back, they might have been under 500 at the start of June each of the last 2 years. Certainly Atlanta, you go back to 2021, was not in a good spot at that point, or even Washington in 2019. So you can, you don't want to write off a season on where a team is on June 9th and 10th, but June has been such an important month for the Mets in the past, 7 years. It feels like June is their make or break time of year. It was a break time for them last year. I think at that point we could see them right around 500, a little bit below 500. Their schedule really gets more difficult in the second half of the season. You look at like the month of August, I think they play something like 6 or 7 home games, maybe 9 home games the entire month. They play a lot of games on the road in August. That's a really tough time of year to play a lot of games on the road. We saw that in 2021 with that West Coast trip. I think it would be a surprise to me if at the start of June, Mets are in London and we're already talking about who they're going to sell at the deadline.
Fair enough. So 2024, obviously, they want to be competitive. We'll see how the roster shakes out. Do you think that with them, wanting to hold onto the prospects, which makes sense, if they're teetering around the trade deadline, and obviously this is far away now, a lot of baseball to play, and they're like right around 500, will they stand pat? Will they be willing to make a move and trade for somebody who's going to be on an expiring deal? Or could you see them saying, well, we're close, but maybe we'll sell, and that's the best move here for us? We don't know about Alonso. Maybe we'll trade him because who knows what's going to happen in free agency. How do you feel this regime might decide to handle a trade deadline where they're somewhere around 500 and it could go either way?
Yeah, I mean, obviously so much of that is dependent on context, where they are in a wild card race, who's ahead of them, and how different players are performing. And I think so much of it is how their younger players are performing. If Pete Alonso is having his usual season, but Mark Vientos is hitting 300 with 20 home runs at the trade deadline as a DH, you say, okay, maybe trading Alonso is more palatable than it would have been otherwise. But I would expect, we've seen this with Stearns in the past in Milwaukee, seen it with a lot of teams like that, a lot of franchises in that spot, the kind of thread the needle approach, which is, again, not what anyone wants, but a situation where, okay, maybe you trade a starter who's on an expiring contract in order to try to get someone who's got more years of team control, spinning off a Jose Quintana for a starter who's younger than that. That would be, I think, a more realistic option for them at a trade deadline in that scenario.
Fair enough. All right. So this season, they're going to play it out, but really it seems to be like all eyes are on 2025. Hopefully not 2026. So 2025 it's really a massive free agent class. And with the way free agency is shucking out this offseason for the Mets, they should have the roster flexibility to go get a Zach Wheeler, go get a Corbin Burns in free agency, one of these guys. And also, of course, Juan Soto is going to be a free agent. Now, the Mets, they've been rumored to all these free agents for years now. Oh, they're going to have to Judge. They're going to have to Ohtani. Are they really going to be in on Soto? And do you think there's a fit there? Because I think, obviously, the Mets, they have this money. But we've been seeing it nonstop here that Steve Cohen's getting played. It's the Steve Cohen effect. The agents are getting the Mets involved to get other teams to pay more money. And obviously, it's going to come down to money. But I think winning is a factor here as well, because if the money's equal and the Mets are coming off a year where they're under 500 again, what's the big selling point to say, come here, we're close? It's a tough sell. So first with Juan Soto, Tim, do you think the Mets are going to be all in on him next year?
I think they would be pretty heavily invested in trying to bring him to Queens. Again, so much depends on how Soto's year in the Bronx goes. There's a chance that, man, he just loves playing for the Yankees, and the Yankees decide they want to go all out to keep him the same way they did for Aaron Judge. But I think you look at how this front office operated. Who was the one guy they went after really heavily this offseason? It was the guy who was 25 years old in Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Who's the guy who most resembles Yamamoto next year? It's not his starting pitcher who's going to be 30 like Corbin Burns. It's Juan Soto, a foundational player who's in his mid-20s. So I think what we've seen from this front office suggests that if they are going to go big after someone next offseason, it would be someone like Soto. That said, I would expect them to be aggressive in the top end of the starting pitching market. Also, from people I've talked to, there is this expectation that the Mets know that their next ace is not residing in AAA this season. It's not coming internally. That there's going to have to be a significant addition externally, and that's not coming this offseason, but it very well might come next when there are more than one option on the free agent market.
Lots of great pitchers for sure next offseason. And the question then to really just come down to it is, we know we're not getting an Alonso extension now, but for next offseason, is it going to be a scenario of it's an Alonso extension or signing a starting pitcher, an Alonso extension or signing Juan Soto? Or is it possible to have Alonso extension plus a Juan Soto plus starting pitching? What do you think is going to happen there?
I think what they've done this offseason puts them in a position to be greedy next offseason. We saw, you look at what the Dodgers offseason was last winter and how little they did. And look, they were in a better position competitively that they could do very little and win 100 games anyway. The Mets aren't in that spot, clearly. But it set them up to be as aggressive as they were on Shohei Ohtani, as aggressive as they were in Yamamoto and Teoscar Hernandez, and to spend as much money as they have. I think the Mets should be in a similar financial position next year with as much money as they have coming off the books, that it is not inconceivable that they can re-sign Alonso in free agency. They can bring in Soto. They can bring in a premier starting pitcher. That should all be on the table for this team with what they have financially.
Well, that is very exciting, and that'll be music to the Mets' ears. We'll have to see how 2024 plays out first. Tim, this has been great. Please let everybody know where they can find you and where they can find your great articles as well.
You can find stories by myself and Will Salmon, who both cover the Mets for The Athletic at theathletic.com. I'm on Twitter at Tim Britton, just my name, nice and simple. You can always find me there.
All right. Maybe you'll find Tim Britton in Great Britain this summer. That'd be quite the series. So you can pitch that to The Athletic. But Tim, this has been great. Everybody make sure you're following Bleav in the Mets, BLEAVINTHEMETS on all social media platforms and, of course, YouTube. I'm on Twitter at Nick_Durst, on Instagram, Nick's Food and Stuff. And until next time, everybody, let's hope for the best and let's go Mets.